Good morning again, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We are quite pleased and honored today to have the Italian Minister of Economy and Finance, Professor Giovanni Tria, to speak on the Italian and European economic outlook and policy changes. That is a relatively anodyne title for a non-anodyne set of policy changes, a challenging set of economic conditions, and a very lively policy debate in Italy, in Europe, and around the world. I just want to say before starting, just a couple quick ground rules. Thanks to the Minister and our colleagues at the Embassy, this meeting is entirely on the record. We're delighted to have members of the Italian and the world press with us. Immediately following Minister Tria's speech, there will be questions and answers. I will probably forego the chair's privilege in order to maximize questions from the floor. Given the time constraint with our late start, we ask that people's questions be quite concise so the minister has time to respond. I also feel obligated to note that this is perhaps the fourth or fifth successive Italian finance minister we have had speak at the Institute. We're quite honored to have that ongoing relationship with the Italian finance ministry, with the embassy, with the successive Italian governments, including friends of ours like Mario Monti, Pier Carlo Padoan, and now, of course, another professor taking office in Italy, Giovanni Tria. We at the Institute work quite closely with the Council on the U.S. in Italy, co-founded by our former board member, David Rockefeller and Johnny Angeli. We worked quite closely, even more so, under the late Sergio Marchionne, who I personally and many others still very much miss. And we look forward to continued work with them, with the Bank of Italy. We are proud to have with us a visiting fellow from the Bank of Italy this year, Claudia Biancotti. In the past, we've had other Italian nationals, including Paolo Moro of the IMF. I say all this not to just rattle your cage and make you anxious to hear the minister, but to emphasize that our research interests, our personal and professional ties to Italy and the economics policy community in Italy are quite strong, and I appreciate the ambassador's recognition of that and the minister coming here today. Again, Giovanni Tria has been Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy since May 2018. He taught at Sapienza University of Rome, University of Perugia, and he's currently Professor of Political Economics at the University of Rome Tor Vergata, where he's been Dean in the Faculty of Economics since 2017. I must admit, running an institute, I find being a full-time job, so being both a dean and a minister, I find an overwhelming prospect, but good for him. He has previously served as a senior advisor in various Italian government ministries, not just economics and finance, but labor and public administration. He had been a member of the board of directors of the ILO, the International Labor Organization, both from 2002 to 2006 and 2009 to 2012. So it is my privilege and my pleasure for a fascinating, I hope, and it's certainly important speech by Minister Tria. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am very pleased with this invitation and honored to be here today. I will start my speech by recalling the last steps followed by Italy during the process of approval of its budget law and in its dialogue with the European Commission. Then, I will briefly explain the aims and the main measures adopted by the Italian government to foster more growth and more social inclusion. In conclusion, I will speak about the European context, highlighting some of the crucial issues that could make Europe more supportive of growth and investment. Since last spring, Italy has been a focus, as you know, of attention in the financial markets and among policymakers, as a new and untested coalition took office and the economic recovery stalled. There is no question that the past 7 months have been challenging and that the outlook is not immune from risks. However, I believe we have achieved important results at the political and policy level, in particular with the recent enactment of the 2019 budget and the agreement with the European Commission. And we can now focus our efforts on concrete actions to revitalize our economy and the process of European integration and to improve social cohesion in our country. As is well known, since the turn of the century, Italy has suffered from unsatisfactory economic performance. The global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the euro area sovereign crisis of 2011 and 12 dealt a further blow to our economy, which only slowly recovered in the period 2014-2017. In this context, the Italian government program aims to improve social cohesion and inclusive growth within a path of debt reduction. To this aim, increased resources are secured to stimulate private investment and to revitalize public investment, both in terms of financing and of technical and organizational resources. In recent quarters, Italy's real GDP growth slowed down because of the fall in the growth rate of trade and the concurrent weakness in the European business cycle. In October, the economic condition worsened, giving support to our thesis that the fiscal stance required to strictly fulfill European fiscal rules could have been excessively tight. In December, the evolving national and international economic scenario made possible an agreement with the European authorities on the budgetary targets for 2019 and 2021. According to this agreement, the nominal deficit target for 2019 has been set at 2% of GDP. We are also committed to lowering the deficit in 2020 and 2021, both in nominal and structural terms. The nominal targets are 1.8% of GDP for 2020 and 1.5% for 2021. These targets will ensure the decrease of the debt-GDP ratio during the next 3 years. Now, let me briefly describe the main policy measures adopted with the budget law. Regarding the policies for inclusive growth, the so-called new citizenship income measure, this measure aims to combine a universal income scheme and a labor market activation mechanism. The income scheme will provide a monthly payment to lift people's income above the relative poverty threshold. Eligibility is defined via a series of income and wealth indicators. The beneficiaries must enroll with employment centers and join a training program, but they lose the benefit if they turn down adequate job offers. The new policy also envisages incentives for firms that hire workers currently enrolled in the program, or for beneficiaries that start a new business or professional activity. These norms are largely experimental, with an envisaged start-off according to a learning-by-doing process. Nevertheless, the measures are designed in a way that should be able to explore and exploit opportunities to expand employment by acting on both the demand and the supply side of the labor market. They include instruments that address the high level of present and predicted job mismatch, such as training and employment search, as well as incentives to employees and employers to search for and provide rewarding work. Through these measures, we try to address 3 crucial issues: the stock of poverty accumulated in the last 10 years, current unemployment, and this is important, the growing expected unemployment due to the technological transition. The government policy program not only addresses Italy's gap on inclusion policies, of course, it also focuses on enhancing the growth potential of the country. As far as taxation is concerned, the 2019 budget broadens the eligibility of the existing simplified tax regime for low-income self-employed professionals and small businesses. The tax rate on net earnings is 15% for the self-employed with the revenue of up to 65,000 euros and 20% for professionals and small businesses with the revenue of up to 100,000 euros. The statutory corporate income tax rate is reduced from 24% to 15% for companies that raise capital expenditure and increase employment. Additional incentive measures for private investment in human and non-human capital and innovation are also financed. Most importantly, the government is committed to increase public investment, which has fallen from 3% of GDP in the 10 years preceding the big crisis to an estimated 1.9% in 2018. The drop in public investment was not only due to fiscal austerity, but also to a gradual loss of planning and execution capacity, especially at the regional and the local level. Furthermore, the anti-corruption policy that was introduced in 2016, the so-called public tender code based on a European anti-corruption directive, this policy increased the complexity and also the unpredictability of the legal framework for public works. Then, relaunching public investment is a key element of the government agenda, but also the greater long-run challenge for the entire economy. Not only public investment has been falling as a percentage of GDP, but also spending for maintaining existing public infrastructures has declined. Many signs indicate that public capital is deteriorating alongside an even more worrisome fall of both the level and the quality of human capital. Because of the vertical fall in the quantity and quality of public investments, in fact, private investment intentions in our country increasingly face the prospect of settlements in backward areas with scarce human capital and insufficient physical and civil infrastructures. Thus, the increase in public investment is needed not only to sustain domestic demand, but mainly to increase the productivity and the return of private capital. What is lacking is not simply traditional public works, but an adequate response to the growing importance of technological progress and the systemic nature of modern infrastructures. We need also more investment in social infrastructures such as schools, universities, research centers, for producing human capital and fueling confidence and dynamism in a scenario dominated by uncertainties and worries about the unexplored future. The crucial cause of the fall in public investment, on the other hand, is the deterioration of the ability of public administrations to manage investment projects in their increasing complexity, from the technical economic planning and maintenance of works to selection processes, evaluation and monitoring. Beyond the financial resources, and in spite of potential and high returns, public capital tends to decrease because the ability to move from intentions to facts finds a prohibitive limit in the human and social resources available for the realization of quality investments. These considerations are not new. What is new in the action of this government is, however, the attempt to run an ambitious new experiment of economic policy by allocating a critical mass of resources in reconstructing the administration ability to plan, design, and manage the infrastructure necessary for economic development. To this end, in the budget law, the government increases the funds available to public investments, but also allocates new and increasing resources to address the problem of substantial unspent appropriations that have accumulated due to the limited capacity of the administration to translate them into concrete achievements. Policy for social inclusion and private and public investment are also necessary to meet the long-term challenges of the new technologies and the worldwide drive for their adoption, which carry high long-term risks and make them widespread. This depends on intrinsic dangers in the commoditization of knowledge and on the diffusion process induced by hyperconnectivity. But it also relates to the new economic instability of the middle-income class, disenfranchised and endangered by failure to adapt to new technologies and international factor movements. These risks include threats to present jobs and rents and perceived rights of all sorts, magnified by the intrinsic fragilities of the wealth position of the middle class that is highly dependent on economic growth and established order for the maintenance of its present and precarious well-being. The promise of technological progress with the menacing announcement of increased automation, higher factor mobility, and lower border protection for nationally entrenched rights, therefore, of creative destruction. A recent debate challenged the well-established idea that the contribution on GDP of the creative component of innovation, this means productivity and employment, is much bigger of the effect of the destructive component, at least in the long run. Although this idea has been confirmed by the history of the economic growth, we know that when and where the destruction occurs and when and where the creation occurs is relevant in short and medium term. In other words, we have to consider the negative externalities due to the distribution of the destructive effects of innovation across productive sectors, firms, citizens, and countries. This demands both a strengthening and reform of social protection for those left behind by the technological race. This is also necessary because of the negative effect arising from the fact that the current globalization of the economy can increase the risk implicit in any innovation investment. Because of the increased speed of both technological change and its diffusion around the world, and as a consequence, the speed of technological obsolescence of previous innovations and investments. That is to say, that if the firms that invest in innovation and new technologies risk to never be able to reach the break-even point in time for a business return, the destructive component of the Schumpeterian competition in this new context can have a growing negative impact also on the investments decision of potential innovators and investors. In sum, investment and social inclusion are the pillars of our economic strategy, not only from the short-term perspective, but also in response to a vision for long-term challenges. Thus, I trust that firms and financial market investors will realize that Italy's new policy framework is aimed to improve the investment climate and social cohesion, trying to combine financial and social stability. Of course, for our economic policy plans to be fully realized, we need a supportive and consistent European framework. This noise is probably, there has been much noise about Italy, new coalition, and its views about Europe. This noise is probably the main reason why our sovereign bonds are trading at yield levels that still look excessive even after the agreement with the European Commission vis-à-vis our country's fundamentals. These fundamentals are trade and current account surplus, balanced net international investment position, high level of net financial wealth, continuing primary surplus since the beginning of the century, also the second largest European manufacturing sector. But this noise explains why the high Italian debt that is a legacy of the last century, even though it's a burden for Italian economy, has been and is fully sustainable. This is particularly true in an environment characterized by historically low interest rate below growth level. Nevertheless, the Italian government is determined to reduce public debt continuously and progressively. I want to be also very clear on the relationship between Italy and Europe. Our government wants to change Europe, but believes that Italy's position is and will remain in the European Union and in a single currency. However, we think that European economic policy needs a major boost in terms of deepening of the integration process, the governance of global processes, and the taking charge of an ambitious and transformative macroeconomic and fiscal policy program aimed to growth and to regional and social inclusion. Some of the mechanisms of the currency union, including those that were introduced during the debt sovereign crisis, are intrinsically deflationary, notably due to the symmetric treatment of fiscal and current account surpluses and deficits, and also the difficult coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. This deflationary bias needs to be redressed, as the model of export-led growth and fiscal surpluses of some of our European partners contributes to internal and external aggregate imbalances, and is one of the causes of Europe's aggregate low growth performance. It also fuels divergence and fragmentation within the Union and is ultimately unsustainable and self-defeating, given the trade tensions and the negative spillovers that it engenders. Discussing all the facets of European Monetary Union reform would take an entire seminar. I will simply close by saying that we believe Europe's fiscal stance must be more supportive of growth, and in particular of investments. Imbalances must be addressed not only via structural reforms, but also through a euro area budget focused on rebalancing and competitiveness, and in particular on investment in modern infrastructure, research, innovation, and sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Tria. It is always welcome when academically qualified ministers bring in the human element, and with your labor background, you clearly do that in your consideration of social peace and investment. It was also important to hear your remarks at the end about Europe, because as you framed the issues of technological change and social inclusion, these are issues facing all the wealthy West, the US, Europe. We have to think about it together. Could I just ask you one question before opening it up to the audience, which is, why do you think the markets have been so reluctant to see the benefits of the public investment program you are proposing? They're not terrified by it, to be clear, but it's not as though spreads have come all the way in. What do you think is the issue?
But I think that the market is not terrified by the investment program. Maybe it's terrified by other measures, because some other measures have been seen as a just social protection for poverty and unemployment, etc. And the market don't see enough our intention to increase public investments. So this is the real problem. But I think that, and I tried to say it before, is that social stability is important for growth. And also, we don't have to see just that the level of poverty in Italy or in other countries, or the high unemployment that come from the two recession that we had in the last decade. But the problem, as you said, that is we share with all the advanced countries, is the problem is how to govern the social issues that come from the technological transition. We had to look at the future. We had to anticipate this issue, because otherwise we see rising sentiment against free markets, free trade, and some disruptive policies. Then we have to consider better how the social protection net is important for advanced countries within the process of globalization. We have a governance at the global level in different fields, but social protection for the losers is a matter for national policies. And this creates a kind of a possible crash in public finance, because also in Europe it's quite difficult to combine the growth policies for investment and the social policies. Then we have, I think that we have to convince the market that increase public investment in all kinds of infrastructure, we used to say material, but is in general, is also very important for the productivity and the return of private investment, because the question is, on one side, why public investment infrastructure are so low in Italy, but not only in Italy, in Europe, and in USA. But why also, from the historical level, also the private investment are too low. There is a connection. We have to see this connection in a framework of this kind of, called the hyper connectivity that characterize the current globalization, with the risk that I try to focus on.
Just one quick follow-up, if I could. In your view, and this isn't a specific Italy question, can we buy social stability? I mean, you seem to be saying that there are social programs or employment programs that will get the inclusion we want and that will stabilize matters. But of course, there's a wide variety of countries in Europe that have quite generous welfare states where the social instability seems to be motivated more by anti-immigrant feeling or nationalism. Do you think this is an economic problem we can buy our way out of?
No, I think the social stability is an economic problem. But of course, we can solve this social and economic problem only through this building this new social protection net. But we have to increase growth. Then we can't separate social protection and the problem of investment, how to solve the problem of investment. If we separate the two policies, certainly will failed because we will not have enough resources. Of course, we'll go through financial instability. But also, if we ignore the problem of social protection, we can have a social instability and then difficulties in adopting policy for fiscal consolidation. For example, look at what's happening in France. Then just because they wanted to dismiss a kind of tax reduction, they had this big reaction, social reaction. I don't think that we can think about that this reaction is only linked to this measure. But it's a big problem.
Thank you. Let me open it up to the floor. The minister has graciously agreed to take questions on the record. Just two ground rules. There is a traveling mic up front in the hands of Jessica. If you're at one of the front tables to the front row, I'll recognize you. If you're at the back, please walk forward to the standing mic, and you can ask a question from there. The second ground, yes, don't be scared. The second ground rule is please identify yourself when asking a question, please.
My name's Desmond Lochman. I'm at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you very much for those remarks. It's generally recognized right now that there are many downside risks to the global economy, whether it's the China trade issue, Germany slowing, Brexit, what have you. My question to you is, what happens if those risks materialize and the European economy and the Italian economy go back into recession? What would the Italian government's response be in terms of fiscal policy? Would you engage in fiscal stimulus to get the growth going, or would you engage in fiscal tightening to try to keep the debt from rising but risk going into a deeper recession?
But this is always the crucial dilemma when there is a slowdown or recession, because from one side we need more expansion in fiscal policy. The other side, we know that during a slowdown or recession we have a problem in public finance, and then we have to be more prudent. What is problem is how to find a balance between these problems, and I think that we have to consider how deep can be the slowdown or the recession. Currently, our agreement, for example, with the Commission is on structural deficit. This means a deficit estimated without consideration of the cycle. Then we don't need to change our fiscal policy, our forecast income or expenditures just to meet the European fiscal rules. Of course, the question is if we decided to try to sustain more growth with a more expansive fiscal policy. I think that looking at the situation of what can be the expected evolution of the economy, we don't need to change our target. And then I think that we have to keep our target. Also because our estimate about evolution of fiscal of our public finances, our estimates are quite prudent because they have been based on what we call the trend growth rate, that at the moment of this estimate was 0.6. Then, of course, the impact of the deficit told us it is possible to reach 1% of growth. Of course, these estimates are 2 months ago. The estimates are changing month after month. But at the moment, I don't see the necessity to adopt a fiscal policy more tight or more expansive. Of course, we have to consider what's happening, what will happen, and also if, this is important, if Europe recognize that as a Europe we have to react. Also, for example, what Germany will do. This is the engine of the European economy. The slowdown in Germany is quite strong, and Germany has fiscal space to adopt an expansion fiscal policy. I think they are thinking about that. They have to do that, I think. For Germany, so maybe we can have an impact in Europe, and then maybe it's possible to avoid a real recession.
Yeah, but Germany is restrained by constitutional amendment.
Yes, but I think they are trying to adopt some measures on taxes. And also we have to look at what the European Central Bank will do, of course. Always I think the debate is Europe as, not Europe and other international institutions like IMF, the idea is we have to create buffers, just to use this buffer when the crisis arrives. The problem is if in this way we anticipate the crisis. We know that we have to anticipate. Fiscal policy works if they anticipate the recession, just when we have the slowdown, because we need time for the effectivity of the fiscal policy. If we arrive, according to the mainstream, to adopt a fiscal expansionary policy when we are in a recession, I think that this could be too late, and at the very end we arrived to adopt a pro-cyclical, not anti-cyclical policy.
Thank you. Next question at the back, please.
Paolo Mauro from the IMF. You didn't talk about the changes to the pension system, and perhaps it would be useful for an international audience to hear what was your rationale, what were your objectives for those?
The rationale is that this is a temporary measures. that will work as an experiment for 3 years. Then we don't want to change the actuarial estimate for the medium long term. But the problem is that we try to deal with a transition problem created by the last reform. Because with the last reform, we decided to postpone 5 years in Italy the time of retirement, and it worked like a dam. People couldn't follow a normal turnover with the retirement. Then we saw that many firms met a problem, because in a period with a very fast technological change, we had to consider that it's not so wise to decrease the turnover, but maybe we need to increase the turnover of the competences. Then we try to to permit these people to exit the work, to exit from the firms, and then in this way the firms can have a change in the composition of the labor force with a maybe new competence, etc. We don't know if we'll have a positive or negative impact on employment, but I think that we can have a positive impact on productivity of the firms, because in this way we try to liberalize the time of the retirement.
Great. Another question, please.
Doug Redeker, International Capital Strategies and Bookings. Mr. Minister, in your remarks, you made reference a couple of times to the market's perception of Italy and sovereign spreads. One of the things you did not mention as a concern is the health of the Italian banking system. I wonder if you could just talk about the status of reforms to the banking system, the need to consolidate the sector, and how you are going about the NPL reduction that a lot of outside observers are looking at as a key component to Italy's financial health moving forward.
I hear very well
So,
the question, but it's
the
on the
question-
banking
the
system
question- The
and
question
NPL.
is,
Yes.
what is the state of reforms and
Yes.
where do you see that going?
But I think that in the past years, the Italian banking system consolidated. Now we are more solid than before. We are solving the problem progressively of the NPL. The stock of NPL is reducing according a program approved by European Commission, and that come from an agreement with the European Commission, and according to the program, the NPLs are of the stock of NPLs is reducing. You know that the problem of NPLs come from the two recessions that we have, because in the banking system, Italian banking system, we had some isolated problem of mismanagement, but in general, the problem on NPLs came from the recession, the economic problem. Also, the new NPLs now are at the level prevailing before the crisis, at the normal level. Then I don't see systemic problem in our banking system. We have 1, 2 medium, small banks that have some problems, but we are monitoring, and we don't see any big problem. We are monitoring, and also we are intervening within the framework of European rules. and I think that we can find a market solution for these banks. I mean, Carige or some others.
Thank you. This will be the last question, please.
Thank you. My name is Paola Agostini from the World Bank. My question, Minister, is related to GDP and wealth. We are discussing a lot in the countries where we work that they should now use not only GDP as a measure of how the economy is doing, but really the wealth of the nation based on three main components: human capital, produced capital like infrastructure, and natural capital. And this is because we want a country to grow, not only to grow, but to grow sustainably. So you, in the case of Italy, explained to us that we are going to invest in human capital, we are going to invest in infrastructure, and I'm wondering what space you have to invest also in natural capital, since we have a lot of disasters that happen in Italy due to land degradation and washing out of actually infrastructure every time it rains too much, or pollutions in the oceans, so that it affects our tourism industry, etc. So the question is, are we investing in natural capital? Thank you.
Yes, of course. When I speak about public investment, important part of that is not only in new infrastructure, but is infrastructure related to the natural capital, because as you know, we had disaster for hydrogeological Italian situation, and in the agreement with the European Commission about the deficit, we received also flexibility, because important part of the public investment planned by the government will be spent on investment for the hydrogeological system. Then we are is one of the focus of our planning public investment, and also we have to invest also, but this is a problem also of private investment, but we have to create the environment for more investment in circular economy. This is important. This is a part of the public investment plan, and in this way, we want to create the environment that can be friendly for private investment. We have to connect. We have too low private investment in this field, in green economy, circular economy, and also we have to involve more the private capital with a partnership with public capital in infrastructure investment, but a new kind of infrastructure. We have to, for example, we have to build schools, universities, hospitals, but now we have to embody in these buildings, in this investment, smart technologies, eco-technology, etc. This means that in this way we can support a kind of demand-driven technological innovation for the private sector that come from the government. I mean, the public investment.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thanks to the Embassy for their partnership. Thanks to all of you for attending today, to our friends online for watching and for your patience. And most of all, thanks to Minister Tria. We are delighted to have you present so comprehensively the program from Minister of Economy and Finance, Giovanni Tria. Thank you very much.
Thank you.